The world of AI is just swimming in cash right now. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars being poured into building the infrastructure for AI future. But there's this huge question hanging over everything. Is all this money building a revolutionary new economy, or are we watching the biggest, most complicated bubble in history inflate right before our eyes? Okay, let's get into it. Just look at this number for a second. $12 billion. And get this, that's how much capital a single company managed to raise in just 1 year. That company is CoreWeave. They're what's called an AI hyperscaler. Basically, they're one of the companies building and renting out the giant server farms that all this AI actually runs on. And here's the crazy part. They're just one piece of this massive, massive puzzle. So that brings us to the real mystery we're going to try and unpack. Where is this absolute flood of cash coming from? And maybe more importantly, is it actually creating real sustainable businesses? Or is there something else going on behind the scenes? To really get what's happening, you have to see it for what it is. It's a gold rush, a modern-day digital gold rush. And all the big tech companies, they are scrambling to stake their claim, absolutely terrified of being left behind in the dust. And I mean, the numbers are just insane. You've got Microsoft throwing $10 billion at OpenAI. Then you have Amazon and Google combining for over $6.5 billion into a rival called Anthropic. And of course, the chipmaker NVIDIA is right in the middle of everything, jumping in on deals like a $1.3 billion investment in Inflection AI. And here's what's really key. This isn't your typical startup money anymore. No, these are the biggest corporations on the planet cutting these massive checks. Okay, but all this money flying around creates a pretty big math problem. The venture capital firm Sequoia actually did the math, and they came up with what they're calling AI's $600 billion question. And it's simple, really. Can the AI industry actually make enough money from customers to pay for all this stuff? All right, let's do the math together. It's actually not that complicated. Everything starts with the undisputed king of AI chips, NVIDIA. Right now, they're on pace to sell something like $150 billion worth of these data center chips this year alone. So let's use that as our starting point. But here's the thing. The chips themselves are only about half the cost. You got to double that number just to cover everything else it takes to run a massive data center. The power, the cooling, all the networking gear. So boom, right away, we're at $300 billion. Okay, now, the companies that are actually buying all these chips, the Microsofts, the Googles, the AI startups, they're not doing this for fun, right? They need to make a profit. So if we assume a pretty standard 50% profit margin, you have to double the number again to figure out how much revenue they need to bring in from actual paying customers. And that gets us to this absolutely jaw-dropping number. $600 billion. That's the target. That's how much new revenue the AI industry needs to generate every single year just to make all this spending make financial sense. And here's where it gets a little awkward. The goal, remember, is $600 billion. But the actual revenue of the biggest player in the game, OpenAI, it's sitting at about $3.4 billion. I mean, that's not a gap, that's a Grand Canyon. So what gives? How on earth is this massive hole being filled? Well, this is where the story gets really interesting and, frankly, kind of controversial. It turns out the machine is being funded, at least in part, by this weird circular flow of money that's setting off all kinds of alarm bells on Wall Street. So to get this, we need to know the difference between two terms. First, there's vendor financing. Totally normal, happens all the time in business. But then there's this other thing called round-tripping. That's when an investor gives a company money, but with the understanding that the company will just turn around and use that money to buy the investor's own products. It makes it look like sales are booming when really no new money has entered the system. Someone online put it perfectly. They called it a round-tripping Ouroboros, that mythical snake that eats its own tail. Let's trace it. NVIDIA invests in a company like OpenAI. OpenAI takes that money and uses it to rent cloud services from Oracle. And then Oracle takes that revenue and uses it to buy more chips from, NVIDIA. It's a perfect self-funding circle. Now, of course, the companies involved would say, hey, what's the big deal? When Microsoft's CFO was asked how they account for the billions OpenAI spends on their cloud platform, she basically said, look, they're just a customer like anyone else. Which, okay, fair enough. But when you're also their biggest investor, you can see how the lines start to get a little blurry. You know, if you're getting a weird sense of deja vu right now, you are not wrong. We have actually seen this movie before. We just have to rewind the clock to the dot-com bubble for a pretty serious cautionary tale. Let me tell you about a company called Lucent Technologies. In the late 90s, these guys were on top of the world. And their big secret? They were aggressively lending money to their own customers just so those customers could buy Lucent's equipment. And they booked it all as revenue. The stock went through the roof. But you can probably guess what happened next. The bubble burst, their customers couldn't pay back the loans, and poof, Lucent's value just evaporated. It was all about keeping the growth numbers looking good no matter what. I mean, you had these telecom companies that would literally sell network capacity to each other in these totally fake deals just to book revenue. One of the executives even admitted later in Congress, "We swapped capacity like baseball cards. It was just a game to keep the stock price up." Okay, but what really ties this all together and what makes it so risky is the brutal physical reality of the hardware itself. We're not talking about building a railroad that'll last 100 years. These billions are being spent on assets that become obsolete really, really fast. It's just this relentless, punishing cycle. The hardware physically wears out and you gotta replace it every few years. It sucks up an insane amount of electricity, and the absolute killer is that the pace of innovation means that today's top-of-the-line chip is basically tomorrow's paperweight, often forcing you to physically rebuild your data centers just to keep up. I mean, here's a perfect example. The NVIDIA H100 chip, that was the gold standard just last year. But the next generation, the B100, offers 2.5 times the performance for only about 25% more money. This means all those billions that companies just spent on H100s, the value of that investment is just plummeting. It's a ridiculously expensive treadmill to be on. So where does that leave us? What's the final verdict? Is this a massive bubble just waiting to pop? Or is all this crazy spending actually building the foundation for the next technological revolution? You know, the funny thing is, the answer might just be yes to both. Let's think about who wins and who loses. You know how on a gold rush, the people who really got rich were the ones selling the shovels? Well, it's the same thing today. The shovel sellers are the chip companies like NVIDIA, and they are making a fortune. The startup founders who get all this cash to build their vision are winning too. The potential losers? Well, that would be the investors funding this whole cycle, especially if that $600 billion in real customer revenue never actually shows up. So I'll leave you with this to chew on. Is all this circular investing just a necessary evil to build the infrastructure of tomorrow? Kind of like how speculators built the railroads back in the day? Or is this whole thing just the world's most expensive and complicated game of hot potato, with everyone hoping they aren't the one left holding the bag when the music stops? I guess the next few years are going to give us our answer.